Deja vu, it's time to finish my basement. Last year I finished half of my basement into an apartment, and this year I'm finishing the rest. So in this series, I'll show you how to finish your basement from A to Z, and this is the full video. The framing, electrical, insulation, drywall, painting, and floors. So my basement's kind of big, it's about 2,000 square feet. I finished 800 of it into that basement apartment right there. I also have this 150 square foot bedroom, and I also have a 500 square foot shop, and also a utility room just back there. It's about 200 square feet. Utility room, storage room. Anyways, that's my basement. We're gonna start with the framing. When I framed out my basement, I knew there was gonna be a wall here, and so I framed this wall. Here's a problem, I did half of it wrong. I framed this wall at the beginning, where I framed everything on the floor and then stood it up, and I framed this other little part of the wall right here at the end. And I did not frame this on the ground and stand it up. Instead, I framed it in place. And you can see that there's not a double top plate. So that's the problem. I'm gonna take this wall completely out and redo it properly. I hate it, but hey, we have to meet code. We have to make sure that everything is done right. So I'm not excited for that, but at least there is a small silver lining in which I have the right tool for the job. Zenith by Danco sent me over some tools like this self-prying bar, which is gonna make tearing this wall down a breeze. They also have other stuff like this trim puller, which means that you can take apart your baseboards without damaging the drywall. And you'll see how these work in just a minute. Well, I can't procrastinate any longer. Let's demo. So fun.
While I do need to add a double top plate for it to meet code, that's also not the only reason I'm moving this wall. The biggest reason I would say that I'm moving this wall is because it's just simply in the wrong place. So the whole rough open for the door needs to move over about 6 inches to the left. That's the primary reason for why I'm doing this. And I'm trying to reuse all of the exact same lumber to save on costs. So I also had to remove all the nails and recut everything, which took some time.
So I set the laser and I pointed it right down here at the bottom, and the laser goes perfectly vertical. So all I need to do is line up the top of the board on the right side of that laser, and then I have a perfectly plumb board.
About 1.5 years ago, I made a full video on framing a basement. It goes over all the basics, all the stuff you need to know about the framing members and how to do most things that you're gonna come by in a basement. So if you want a more detailed video on that, I'll have a link in the description.
I had to reframe this door opening, and I also had to frame this door opening. Oh, and a bulkhead right there. And it was really nice just to be able to do some smaller stuff. So now that the framing's done, the next thing I'm gonna do is electrical. So I'm gonna be running the outlets, the lights, stuff like that. And I'm gonna start here in the guest room, and then I'm gonna move into the shop. And I'm gonna be doing nothing too fancy, just a standard, run of outlets. So the first thing we're gonna mark are where our outlets are going. So I'm gonna go around the room and I'm gonna mark at 18 inches everywhere there's gonna be an outlet. Then the next thing I'm gonna mark is where the switch is gonna be for the room, and that's gonna be at 48 inches. I wanna make it pretty clear that I'm not an electrician. I've just done electrical work in the past. I really enjoy doing it, and I've just studied the code and built according to what the code requires in my area. So make sure and study your local code in your area, because it might be totally different in terms of outlet spacing, heights of receptacles, the gauge wire you need, how many outlets you can run. So please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. And if there's something you see that I could be doing better, please leave that in the comments so that we can all learn from each other. Okay, let's mark these outlet boxes. Now we'll bring a box up to the mark, and we're gonna make sure that that mark is level with the top of the box, and we're gonna nail it in. The next thing we need is to drill holes for us to be able to run the wire through the wall. And you don't have to be as OCD as I am about this, but I'm gonna go through and make a mark at 24 inches across all of my studs that I need a hole drilled into, and that's just gonna make pulling the wire a lot easier, and it's also just gonna look a little bit nicer. But make sure that when you drill these holes, they are directly in the center of the stud. Next, we're gonna run the electrical wire, and I'm using 14-2 because this is a 15 amp service. And 14-2 wire means that there are actually 3 wires. There's a white, a black, and a copper. The copper is your ground, the white is your neutral, and the black is your hot. So we're gonna run that wire from each outlet box to the next, leaving about 6 inches of slack. So I got all of the outlets and the switch in, and I even installed an outlet for outside, and the only thing that's left is the ceiling fan, but it's honestly basically the same thing. What happened there was I forgot to get 14.3 for that because it's gonna have two switches, one for the fan and one for the light. So I need to go run and get that. I could have ran 2 lengths of 14.2, but I didn't have enough for that. But anyways, that is really simple. You do the same thing that I just showed. You just run the wire from the box, and that's it for the rough end. And that's about as far as we can get right now. We can't add outlets or switches or do the electrical trim out until after we've done drywall and painted. So I'm gonna get insulation on all the exterior walls, and even this one that had fiberglass insulation in it, and I just took that out because I'm gonna replace it with rock wool, which is a very good soundproofing insulation, which is gonna be really good considering I have tenants on the other side of that wall. So let's keep moving and we'll revisit the electrical later.
All this insulation that I'm putting in this wall is actually reused from the previous wall that I just removed it from. I don't know why I did that. When I was building the basement, I had a serious deadline, and so I just threw some insulation up for some soundproofing. I should have just installed rock wool from the beginning. So anywhere that air can get through, sound can get through. Obviously you can't make it airtight, but sealing all of those gaps with some expanding foam is a great way to help reduce sound transfer. And I replaced all of the insulation that I had just taken out with some rock wool. This is a soundproofing insulation, and it costs basically the same amount as the fiberglass stuff. And now I'm adding some boric acid to the bottom plates, which kills roaches, so definitely do this. Then after cutting away all the excess expanding foam once it had dried, I added what's called soundproofing joist tape to all of the studs. Its primary use is to go on top of floor joists to eliminate squeaking and minimize sound transfer from the top to the bottom floor. It's not the most effective way to soundproof, but it's very cheap for how much it helps. Next up was the drywall, and you always want to start by hanging the ceiling first. I don't remember if this is code or just best practice, but I'm using 5/8 drywall on the ceiling because it's more rigid, so it's gonna have less sagging over time. And drywalling a ceiling is definitely a job that you don't want to do alone. You definitely can, and in which case I would 100% recommend the use of a drywall lift. In fact, even with help, I wish I had a drywall lift. It was kind of silly not to rent one. They're very cheap to rent. I think you can rent one for like 80 bucks for the entire day. So don't be like me and go rent one. And then I drywalled all the walls, and I would spend more time going over the drywall techniques and everything, but drywall's not my forte, okay? So I don't feel like I'm the best teacher of how to do this properly. And for added soundproofing, even though I'm doing the rest of the room with 1/2-inch drywall, these two walls you see now are both getting 2 layers of 5/8.
Drywall's hung. Now it's time to move on to my least favorite part, mudding and taping. So you can tell I'm super excited for this, but let me give you a quick show of where we're at right now. So we are done hanging. We hung this entire room, and then also this hallway. The builder had this already done up to where it was cut out. And I'm finishing all of this. That right there is going to be a door. So there's actually already a header in the wall. That's totally hollow right now. Probably sometime later, I'm going to cut this out, put in an exterior door there. There you go. Now it's time to move into mudding and taping.
The only corded drill I had at the time was really old and super slow RPMs, and it just couldn't get the job done, so I decided to just raw dog it with my hand. Super unconventional, but hey, it actually worked really well. Astonishingly well. To start off the mudding process, I first filled all of the screw holes with a layer of mud. This is by far the easiest part of drywall mudding because you kind of can't mess it up. Then came the actual hard part of mudding and taping, and again, I'm not good at this, so go watch someone else if you want a tutorial on how to do it well, but basically, you do a layer of mud, and then you can put the tape down, you flatten it out, you put some more mud on top of the tape, and then you flatten it back out. Then you'll repeat that process like 3 or 4 more times. I did 4 coats, and eventually you get a nice smooth surface. Now it's time to add the doors, and I ordered these doors like 6 months ago in preparation for this project because I knew I'd have a short deadline, but the doors I was sent were actually the wrong ones. These are meant for a 2x4 wall. This is a 2x6 wall. But that's future Clayton's problem, so let's just hang these doors. My method of hanging doors is to get them level and plumb, and then to screw in the hinge side first, then you can shim out and screw in the jamb side. I wasn't filming because I was really upset, but after hanging this door, I realized that I hung it on the wrong side of the 2x6 wall because it's the wrong size door, right? So it wouldn't open all the way, so I had to take it back down and rehang it on the other side. I don't know if that's gonna make sense right now, but that's what I did. Now let's address the issue of the doors being sent the wrong size. So I got some 1x3s at Home Depot, and then I ripped them down to about 2 inches, and then I cut them to length at the miter saw to be the exact same height and width as the door. Then over at the drill press, I countersunk some 3/8 inch holes about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch deep, and I did that about every 12 inches. You definitely don't need a drill press for this, it'll just be a little bit more accurate. Then I pre-drilled and screwed both of these pieces together to create a more rigid frame. And if you've done everything the way I've showed you, you just created a door jamb extension in like 20 minutes. So now after screwing that onto the existing door jamb, it's flush with the drywall. Now we're ready to trim out the doors and the window, and I'm a cheapskate, and I just couldn't get myself to buy the proper material to do this because it's just so expensive. So instead I had some MDF that I ripped down into 3 and 6 inch strips and then rounded all of the edges over to make it just to add some detail. No worries if you don't have a router table, you can just use a palm router, any router that you have, or you could just use a sander. It just might be a little bit more inconsistent. Anyways, the next thing to do was to install this, and I'm using an 18 gauge brad nailer to nail this into the door jamb, and then I'm grabbing a 16 gauge finish nailer to nail it into the studs. And I'm not gonna bore you with it, but it was the exact same process to do the window as well, except I didn't use MDF for the windowsill or jamb because it just is so bad with moisture. So instead I used a plywood, but even better would be solid wood. That's what I'd recommend. It's this point of the process where things really start to speed up because the next step is painting. So now I went around and started caulking all the seams between the trim and the walls. I scraped up all of the loose mud and then vacuumed all the floors because I want all of the dust totally gone. Then I dusted all of the walls and vacuumed again. And then I masked off the window, which is basically the only place I had to mask off, and we're ready to paint. I had this Wagner Control Pro 190 from when I did a larger project, so I just went ahead and used that, but honestly it's overkill. You would have no problem rolling this entire thing. And honestly, I back rolled anyway, so I kind of rolled the entire thing as well. And I'm sure it seems kind of counterintuitive to spray and then back roll, but it is a lot faster to back roll than to actually be applying the paint with that. But really the most important reason I'm back rolling is because it just creates a better adhesion to the drywall, especially when you're doing your primer. Like if between the primer and the coat of paint, if there was just one that you could back roll, it would be the primer. Like that's the most important one to back roll. You could spray after that and it's gonna have great adhesion, but it's the primer to the unfinished drywall. That's the place that you just need it to stick super well. And the second reason is because honestly, I kind of suck at spraying. And so back rolling just evened out any streaks I had or anything like that. And I just got a much better finish. So after the coat of primer, I sprayed the coat of paint and then I came back, masked off and painted all of my trim. And for this, I do have a recommendation based off experience. That's cabinet door and trim enamel by Behr. It's great, strong paint that self-levels. It's awesome. Then I jumped right into flooring and I first started by undercutting all of the door jambs and door casing so that the flooring would fit perfectly underneath it. And don't forget to vacuum. You want no dust on the floor afterwards. And you need to space your flooring about 1/4 inch off of the walls. And you could use some spacers that they sell specifically for this, or you could be lazy like me and just use some scrap wood that's 1/4 inch thick. Then I just went one by one down the room installing each plank of flooring. It's super easy to do LVP, and there are a billion tutorials out there on YouTube on how to do it, and I'm sure that they could teach you much better than I can, so I'd recommend you go check out a different tutorial. There's a great one by Brad from Fix This Build That I'd recommend. I'll link to that in the description. I'm just cutting my flooring with a utility knife, and when I got to the 45-degree corner, I just used a speed square to mark that 45 and then cut that with the knife, and it worked out great. And this last row up against the wall had to be cut on the table saw to about 4 or 5 inches wide. And I hate this, but the flooring in the stairwell had to go the opposite direction because it had to match how it was gonna be on the stairs. So I laid that down and it's going the wrong way, but it's fine, okay? It's fine. At least I'm trying to tell myself it's fine. With that done, the stairs were next. And I'm not gonna lie, this process really sucked. I hated doing the stairs. The first thing I did was pre-paint all of my pieces for the, what are they called? Skirt boards, that's what they are. I installed the skirt boards, which was very easy at the top, but when it got to connecting it to the floor, all of those angles took me like 2 hours to figure out, so that was fun. And that got nailed twice at every stud. At this point, I couldn't put off doing the stairs any longer, so I had to jump into that. And for the stair nosing that I'm using, I had to actually get rid of the bull nose in the front of the treads, which I kind of regret, but that's what I did. Okay. Doing stair treads is kind of miserable because it's just a slow process that you have to do one by one. So you need to do what I am doing right now. It's gonna make the process a lot less terrible. What I'm doing is I'm making a jig that is going to mimic the exact shape of each stair tread and riser. This thing is essentially going to mean that I don't have to use a tape measure a single time, and I can build the entire staircase. Here's how it works. There are 3 pieces to this jig. The middle part has 2 slots, and the side parts have just a hole for a bolt that's countersunk. So we'll throw the bolt into that countersunk hole and then up into the slot, and then we'll throw a wing nut on top. So now what we'll do is take it back over to the stairs, we'll put it on the tread that we need to measure, we'll loosen the nuts and then conform it to fit the space perfectly, then we'll tighten the mech down and bring it back over to our table. Then we'll center the jig on the tread and we'll score each side a few different times, and then we're gonna snap it off on the side of the table, which makes things a little bit easier. Then I laid down a thick bead of construction adhesive and set the stair tread right on top. Then I just repeated the exact same process for the riser. And I did this on the bottom stair first just to give you guys a close-up view, but I actually started from the top and worked my way down. That's the best method for this because you don't want to just be going up and down and stepping on these treads that you just laid. So it's best to work from the top down and to minimize the amount of traffic that goes across these steps for the first day or so. And then I did a very similar process for all of the stair nosing, and this is basically the piece that goes over that gap in between the risers and the treads. And I'm just using construction adhesive, a thick bead along the top, and then I'm taping that down to keep it in place while it dries overnight. And I took the tape off in the morning, and ever since then, it's been great. At this point, I'm happy because all of the hard things are done, right? So now I just basically need to add some baseboards and then do the electrical and mechanical trim out, and I'm done. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but I actually had a pretty serious timeline to meet because my wife was pregnant and her due date was about 10 weeks from when I started this. Right now, I'm on week 9, so I have like less than 1 week until the due date. So it was still a little bit of a crunch, but at this point, I wasn't too concerned. So getting back to it, the most important thing to know about installing baseboards is that anywhere 2 baseboards meet should be a mitered joint, and that's to help minimize the large crack opening up later as the wood expands and contracts. So on a 90-degree corner, each baseboard is mitered 45 degrees, but over on that 45-degree wall, the baseboards were mitered 22.5 degrees, and I nailed it into every stud that it came across. Adding an outlet is a lot easier than you might think, and once you've done it, you can confidently do it again over and over. But the first thing we're going to do is strip back the insulation for the wire to expose the individual wires, and we're going to cut that off as far back as we can. Then we're going to strip the individual wires to the appropriate length, then we will curve the ends of those into a small hook, and we're ready to install the outlet. You'll hook the black wire on the gold screw, the white wire on the silver screw, and the bare wire on the green screw. Then just screw it into the wall and move on to the next outlet. This outlet was a little bit different because I had to use a pigtail to run some constant power through this and up to the light switch, and then from the light switch I have 14.3 that runs up to the ceiling fan. The 14.3 means that there's an additional hot so that you can have 2 switches. One switch to control the light and the other switch to control the ceiling fan. And here you can see me wiring that up. These are pretty easy to wire because they're one-way switches, so you don't have to worry about multiple switches being able to control the same light. So I would just look up a tutorial for that one as well. Again, I'm not an electrician, so take what I say with a grain of salt. My code is likely different than your building code, so do your research. Then after installing all of the plates for all the receptacles and the light switches, I installed the ceiling fan, which is going to be different for every single ceiling fan, so just read the instructions on how yours is supposed to be installed. And when the fan was done, I could finally test out all of my electrical work because everything was connected, there were no loose wires. So I hit the breaker and then tested it, and everything worked flawlessly. The fan worked, the light worked, and all of the outlets were pulling a nice 120 volts. So next, I just finished up the mechanical trim out by adding all of the vent registers, as well as the door hardware. And then I finished up the baseboards by caulking all of the seams and nail holes, and then I touched everything up with some paint afterwards. And the last thing I did was add a little piece of shoe mold in front of the door to help hide the gap between it and the floating floor. So as a quick reminder, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like after. So So let's talk some details, okay? I have a full-time job, so the only time I had available to do this was on the weekends, or I spent some evenings working on this, especially when it came to the drywall mudding. And I finished 2 days before our daughter was born. So that was awesome, because just a few weeks later, I had family coming in from out of town to come visit, meet the baby, so they had a place to stay. I haven't added up all of my costs, and my costs are gonna be different than yours because I had a lot of leftover drywall, mud, and tape. But if you were to do this from start to finish the exact same way that I did, it probably would have cost about $3,000 to $4,000. So honestly, very inexpensive if you do it yourself. If you were to hire this out to somebody else, it would probably cost about 10 grand. That would be my guess. It might be more, just depending on the contractor.
You still might have questions after watching these videos, so check out my channel to see when I finished the basement apartment, because there was a lot more complicated stuff in that. For example, I had to cut my foundation wall and put in an egress window to meet egress code. I built an entire kitchen from scratch, the laundry room, it was a lot more complicated. And I did an entire video dedicated to soundproofing. So if there are other questions you have about finishing your basement, I may have already answered them. Just go to my channel and you can see all of those videos.